With that, I'm going to now ask Nicola to come in and give her remarks, and then we'll go to Paul afterwards. Nicola.
Thanks, Serdar. Let me just share my screen. All right, is that nice and clear and you can hear me?
Perfect.
Yes, excellent. All right, so thanks so much. It's very nice to be here today and to have an opportunity to talk about the Asia Foundation's impressions of current decentralization trends in some of the countries in which we work, with the backdrop of considerations around COVID and the COVID pandemic. I have to say it's also quite daunting to come after such great presentations. Thank you to the panelists so far. It's been really fascinating. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Asia Foundation, we're a US-based international NGO with offices in 18 countries throughout Asia and the Pacific. Okay, so in advance of this presentation, I had the opportunity to spend some time with colleagues in our Philippines, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Indonesia offices, who lead the implementation of a number of large subnational governance programs in countries undergoing a variety of political decentralization processes, in order to get their view on what they see as some of the key trends in this evolving landscape. So I'm drawing here on those reflections. The Foundation's decentralization or subnational governance programming is primarily pursued from a bottom-up, from the bottom up, often working at the intersection between subnational governments, citizens, and civil society groups. Working across fiscal, administrative, and political realms, our efforts seek better development outcomes through the delivery of more responsive and effective local government, whether that be through pursuit of better budgeting practices or designing better service delivery mechanisms. While we do find ourselves engaging national level government institutions through this work, much of it is in the pursuit of improving multi-level governmental relations, coordination between different levels, and supporting central government to better deliver on their decentralization commitments and agendas. In our recent reflections, we discussed what we see as 4 trends that appear to have accelerated during the past 18 months during the COVID pandemic. Indeed, when it comes to the role of local governments and the potential for devolution of powers, COVID could be a critical juncture, and I'll return to that later. Just a couple of caveats before I go on. I am bending the original geographic designation of East Asia and the Pacific a little, which is quite obvious. My apologies for that. But I must also note at the outset that these are 5 distinctly different contexts, and generalizations across them are necessarily tentative, and trends are posited cautiously. Okay, to go on to the first one then. The first is that we feel the relevance of local governments has been distinctly reinforced during COVID in crucial dimensions of the lives and livelihoods of local communities. Where the devolution of key powers and decision-making to local governments may have been quite debatable pre-pandemic, their proximity to local communities, giving them a unique ability to take the temperature on the potential pitfalls and impacts of social distancing measures, is a distinct characteristic of pandemic responses in all the 5 countries. In many places, with COVID, we are seeing the reinforcement, therefore, of the principle of subsidiarity, that decisions should be taken as close as possible to the citizens' effect. We see this in the relevance and efficacy of local governments in their response to the crisis. And while we are some way off from any kind of comparative analysis that would back this up, our sense is that one narrative in the story of local governance during the pandemic will be that it has made a more compelling case for expanding the mandates of local governments by effectively devolving powers for crisis response and post-crisis recovery. In places like Sri Lanka, for example, there's already rising demand from local governments to lead the response on pandemic-related issues such as gender-based violence, mental health challenges, and local economic developments, in ways that make more sense to be bottom-up than top-down. And in many cases, local governments have risen to the challenge of delivering critical services to citizens, despite financial constraints and high health-related risks to frontline workers. In some contexts, this has translated into the second trend, where we see greater recognition by central governments of the role of local governments and commensurate delegation of powers. In the Philippines, for example, COVID response policies have to date been issued at the national level, with local governments left to implement them as best they can. Yet there's increasing recognition that this model is not working, and the national government recently signalled a move to more granular lockdowns to be managed locally, through which local government units will make decisions on pandemic management and mitigation measures. In the Philippines, we're working with 27 local government units, and this greater recognition of the role of LGUs has also stimulated greater fiscal decentralization, as Joseph already mentioned in his presentation a few minutes ago. And from next year, LGUs will receive a funding increase of around 25%. Our Philippines team is providing research and capacity building support to implement these reforms. In Nepal, there are some parallels. For Nepal's decentralization journey starting in 2015, COVID came at a particularly difficult time. Despite the drafting of reams of legislation on the functions of subnational governments, many provinces are still so new that they're struggling to find their own space and functions. Our early public opinion research showed that in terms of the initial round of the distribution of relief, there was overwhelming support for the efforts of local government. It was not surprising that there was also a shift in Nepal from blanket lockdowns, therefore, under the first wave in 2020 to the second wave in 2021, in which decision-making over movement restrictions is decentralized to district-level management, crisis management committees, a decentralized body with representation of local governments. These committees can decide what kind of lockdown, whether it involves transportation, whether schools and businesses close, the areas involved and the timeframe. Given the challenges Nepal faces in terms of coordination between the different levels of government in the relatively new federal system, this delegation of power has been timely. In Nepal, our team has been able to support select municipalities to get across and be able to use their newly devolved functions through our subnational governance program. Yet the situation remains precarious, both de jure and de facto. While local governments have been given an awful lot of discretion in terms of how they spend their funding allocations, the latest Auditor General's report observes that the volume being spent outside the due legal process has significantly increased. This has led to the perception that local governments are incapable of governing accountably and within legal boundaries, which may or may not be the case, but may be the precursor to re-centralisation further down the track. But there is a counter-trend experienced elsewhere, re-centralisation or renationalisation of some powers. While we're seeing devolved powers in some contexts, in others, national emergency committees are steadfastly in place. Although obviously some degree of uniformity is important to a response to a crisis at this scale, there are genuine concerns that some of these newly centralised powers may remain stuck as the pandemic recedes. In Bangladesh, for instance, COVID has contributed to consolidation of power at the centre, exacerbated by the pandemic and the long but decisive shift to single-party rule. Our subnational governance program there supports civil society to engage with local government decision-making in Noakhali and Khulna districts. That's where our work is focused. This work is made all the more challenging when not only civil society, but also political spaces in Bangladesh are shrinking. Since the start of the pandemic, the central government appointed a government secretary to oversee the implementation of mitigation measures in districts. That role is usually played by a locally elected official. So meaning that local political representatives are now bypassed or sidelined in decisions taken in Dhaka. So where powers to address the pandemic are delegated to the centre, local governments, we find, are not only disempowered, but also disincentivised to do more to address the crisis. This is something we've also seen in Indonesia, where we, as already described, a re-centralisation process is also underway. Though we would argue it's not linked to the pandemic, but had momentum well in advance. The rapid decentralisation of powers and budgets to districts over the past 20 years and to village level since 2014 has, to some extent, was perceived as not accruing the benefits that were expected in terms of human and economic development outcomes. Tired of waiting for those results and motivated by centralist incentives, the national government has begun to take back some of its previously devolved powers. And as Bala Menon actually suggested in his presentation in forum yesterday, people must be able to see the promise and understand the benefits of decentralisation. Otherwise, they will start asking questions about the model itself, which is something that appears to be happening then in Indonesia. And there, as a result, subnational governments haven't responded as quickly to the pandemic as they might have, and instead just followed central government directives. At both levels, the economic impacts have dominated the response to the pandemic over the health and social impacts of communities. So a challenge for local governments in the medium term, in places like Indonesia and perhaps more so even perhaps also in Bangladesh, will be to ensure their existing constitutional mandates are secured and their role and functions protected. In this, the role of local government networks will be critical. And moving then on to the fourth, this has also been touched on in the previous presentations. This final trend that we're seeing is accelerated innovation. Some of these are seen within local government bureaucracies themselves. In Sri Lanka, for instance, COVID-19 has pushed local governments to search for innovative solutions and to do so quickly to respond to the service and information needs of citizens in a rapidly evolving situation. In some cases, decades-old bureaucratic silos have been prized open and new forms of collaboration and partnerships have emerged to fight the pandemic. Similarly, in Bangladesh, digital innovations and initiatives have been expedited in areas such as mobile banking and the use of digital platforms for coordination between different levels of government. Yet in many places, the force of local innovation is among communities themselves. In Indonesia, among many other places, the use of technology and social media to access information and services is more evident at the community level than among subnational government bureaucracies. Moreover, across the region, the emergence of citizens' collectives, local self-help groups, and other forms of directed collective action is quite unprecedented. As our research in Southeast Asia showed, we published last year, earlier in the pandemic, civil society organisations and citizens have been filling gaps in service delivery in local communities, often either with or without local government support. So looking forward then, for us, these trends raise several important questions. In addition to the question of how these trends themselves will play out, we pose a few of these by way of a conclusion, as they are the sorts of things that we are looking to explore and that we're interested to research further. We're wondering, for example, what impact is devolution of COVID-related powers to local government having on state-society relations in relation to citizens' trust and confidence in government? And under what conditions do we see improvement? We're also wondering, what's the impact of accelerated digitalisation in regions already marked by wide digital divides, and where lack of connectivity is now a trigger for multiple exclusions. And finally, we're wondering, how can local governments be supported to take advantage of the momentum generated by local collective and civic action for more effective and inclusive governance, and to build from it longer-term community resilience in the face of future threats? I'll leave it there. Thank you.